Hello and welcome back to the second Web Hacking Pro Tips deep dive. Today you're with Jason Haddix and myself, Peter Jaworski. And this, unfortunately, is our second go-around of recording this.
Yep.
I will apologize to Jason on air as we recorded this once already and the audio got butchered, and so we are re-recording it. But not only that, we were going to sit down about a month ago to record this. Scheduling problems, people getting sick, primarily me, work life came up, and so what should be number 3 is actually number 2. But based on our first recording, this is an awesome topic of conversation, and I'm looking forward to digging back into it because actually, as we came out of it, we realized that there were a couple things to cover that we missed, despite talking for 30 minutes. So, with all that said, today we're going to be digging into the content security policy that browsers provide, particularly Firefox and Chrome, since IE doesn't honor CSP. But we'll dig into what CSP is, and then we'll look at two pretty cool bugs. One, Twitter's CSP bypass, and then another most recently from Stam1 on DOM-based XSS on Uber. And it's probably best that we didn't record this when we were originally going to about a month ago because we wouldn't have Stam1 to talk about, and it wouldn't make sense to do another CSP podcast. So that delay has come into our favor. So based on that, just diving in, Jason, you can stop me at any point, interject, but we'll just do kind of a brief overview of what the content security policy is. So in a nutshell, based on my understanding, content security policy is a header that's provided by Chrome, by Firefox. It's written up in our RFC, and essentially what it is it's meant to limit where you can be pulling in, say, CSS, JavaScript, fonts, who can frame your site. It's a bunch of headers that essentially define the security of your site and limit kind of where things can be pulled in from, whether they're local, unsafe, inline, or remote. And so on that note, one of the things that they tend to provide is this idea of security for JavaScript, in that you can say you can't run unsafe inline JavaScript. So I can't actually inject like a broken image tag and execute JavaScript. Does that make sense to you? Have I kind of hit what your understanding of is it?
Yeah, I think this was a learning opportunity kind of for everybody looking at this bug, honestly, because I'm not an expert in CSP. I've definitely run into sites that could use CSP, but definitely not an expert anyway. So like doing the research and just the cursory kind of Googling that we did for these bugs, I've learned a lot about not only the protection itself and the bypass, but also kind of the methodology that people use to do these to do these bugs, right? Like, which are more involved than your general just put in script tag and receive bacon, right, or get payout. So,
Yeah.
So I think that we're going to talk a little bit about that. But yeah, as far as the introduction to what it is, yeah, I mean it prevents script execution based on certain policies, and as an attacker, that's unfortunate. So if you can see that you're getting back certain values, that means that maybe it's time to try to bypass the content security policy if it's blocking you. So yeah.
And it's a cool point that you raise, that some sites could be using this, when they're riddled with XSS. It's definitely one way to protect yourself, but as these two examples will show, it isn't foolproof, right? Like, it is really possible to screw these things up and still leave yourself vulnerable. So if any AppSec people are out there listening, this isn't kind of like the magic bullet to solving your security problems, and we'll show you why, hopefully. So on that note, this first write-up from TBM Null, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right, but
That's how I pronounce it as well.
okay, good. There's safety in numbers. So
Yeah.
essentially what happens here in a nutshell is he goes and he finds a reflector cross-site scripting vulnerability in careers.twitter.com, but it doesn't actually execute. So he sees that there's an injection, but it doesn't pop. And so based on the actual write-up and his example, it looks like he's been able to escape out of an anchor tag. I've got that right? That's your
Yeah.
understanding as well? Yeah.
Yeah,
So it's on a
absolutely.
mouse over. So when you look at the actual HTML for the page. You can see that you've escaped it, but nothing's actually being rendered. And it turns out that if you look in, I think this is correct. If you look at the console for the browser, you'll see that there will always be like a warning there that content security policy has blocked this from occurring. And depending upon how the site's implemented it, you might actually see a call in burp, which goes to like a CSP endpoint, like a report endpoint. And that is meant to notify the site that some content security policy violation has occurred. That always kind of freaks me out on the other side because I wonder if people are actually watching those. But they tend to be fire hoses, right? Like,
Right.
at least from the implementations that I've seen, there tend to be a lot of errors from like fonts coming in and other things that are unexpected. So they tend to occur a lot. But I think when you're hacking, you want to be careful of that because you're going to tip your hat if you keep firing off these alerts. So all that to say, sees that there's an injection, doesn't actually pop. So he has a conversation with Brute Logic who says, go out and find a way to bypass it. To bypass that, and this is maybe the interesting part, and I'd be curious what your thoughts are, he finds analytics.twitter.com, and there's an endpoint there that returns back JavaScript. And it just so happens that analytics.twitter.com is on the whitelist for the content security policy, which Twitter allows for this particular subdomain to pull a script in from.
Yeah.
So let's get into the mind of the hacker. If this were you get blocked by CSP, what would your next step be? Like, what do you think you would go after, or how would you go about trying to find a subdomain where you might be able to pull in JavaScript?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this on the misrecording of the last one, honestly, and I think that your story about the React thing was actually super important, honestly, because we'll talk about it. I guess I'll let you tell that story in a second. But when I'm looking at this and I start putting in your location and anywhere that says URL in a website, a parameter, or something that takes a verbatim URL or host name, that's something I'm going to be testing anyway. So that's like the first step of whatever, right? It's built into my tools, it's built into my brain now, and that's like, I'm going to look for URL redirects, I'm going to see if I can execute JavaScript, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see here as when you look at the source, all right, all my special characters that I need to actually execute this are not HTML encoded in the page when I look at the source. So for all intents and purposes, this should actually work. And so that should be the trigger in my brain. Like, there's something else that's blocking this, right? The only thing that could be blocking this at this point is either Chrome. If I'm in Chrome, Chrome's XSS filter or a browser-based XSS filter, or the content security policy, I think at this point. Maybe there's other magical things, but we can talk about your story with React and kind of like how you came to the realization that was a good one. So
yeah, no, it's a good segue.
And
it's also an embarrassing story. So yeah,
no, it's great though. It's good.
So this is exactly this point, right? So I happen to find my experience with CSP is I found a pretty critical vulnerability where I was able to essentially send a payload to anybody on a site, and this particular site used a CSP, and so when I found this, I could look at the page source just like this, and I could see that my content was actually injected in the page source. It was being rendered unescaped, but there was no alert popping. And so at the time, I'd like to think this was years and years ago, but it wasn't. Maybe 8 to 12 months ago, maybe a little bit longer. I had heard that React was this awesome framework that would block cross-site scripting, and so my first reaction was like, oh, this is React that's blocking this. And digging into it, trying to figure out how React works and how it blocks things. I couldn't find any particular information about it, but my content was there. So anyways, I chalked it up to React being this magical silver bullet that managed to stop cross-site scripting, despite the fact that a payload is rendered unescaped, unsanitized, unencoded on a site. And I walked away for about a week. But it was after that week I happened to be walking the dogs and thinking about this that occurred to me that this is impossible. This can't actually occur. And I don't know what popped into my head or why, but File Descriptor has a blog post that talks about CSP, and he mentions that IE doesn't honor it. So I ran back to the computer, sure enough, fired up IE, and the alert popped. Now I happened to report it at that point, and I still got a great payout for it, but I'm sure I could have maybe even possibly doubled that payout if I had taken the time to bypass the content security policy, which in hindsight, I feel like there must have been a way to do it based on these two write-ups
Yeah.
and the potential holes that you have when you have this broad-based content security policy whitelist for different sites you can pull information in from.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's happened to all of us, honestly, where you like put down a bug and it's just like, oh yeah, there's probably some magical thing that's happening here in this framework or in this security product I'm going against, and I'm just not understanding it because I'm a giant noob. And then like all of a sudden you realize, oh yeah, HTML and JavaScript just work like HTML and JavaScript, and there's nothing magical that can be happening here. So it has to be like something else. Like there has to be something I missed. And I've definitely been through that before, and so but it definitely shows you that, like, if you can get characters into, a page that executes as the right content type, you should be getting cross-site scripting. If you're not, there's probably CSP or something else blocking you. I think your original question was like, how do you go about trying to figure out, at this point, what sources that you might be able to bring in, right? And it's defined for you in the content security policy response, right? So like not only is this giving you a security mechanism, but now it kind of gives the attacker the default blueprint to try to bring back in XSS from these other domains, right? So there's multiple ways you can do this, right? In this example, you can bring it back in via a JSON P or one of our examples, you can bring it back via JSON P endpoint. But really, if your site that you're trying to execute the cross-site scripting against brings back any data that can break that filter, like a URL, or you can modify the URI, or you can even do it via like a subdomain or something, as long as that content's pulled into the page and you can break out of your context, then those are the sites that you should look for that kind of integration with. And I think it talked about like a lot of these will have super permissive CSP policies with like Facebook and Twitter and, any analytics and ad framework that they have running on their site for integrations purposes. And a lot of those places allow you to find a lot of those places allow you to create your own profiles, and then if they're scoping it to, star.analyticsagency.com, you can make your own profile there and then start crafting, some JavaScript somewhere there and try to integrate it back into the site and execute your cross-site scripting. So there's a lot of ways to get content back in and still satisfy the CSP markers, especially when they're doing, splat.twitter.com or splat. Ad or analyticsagency.com. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And by the sounds of it, that's exactly kind of what happened here. It looks like they're using, start.twitter.com. And then, when you're on the analytics page, if you start browsing around your proxy history, you're going to want to look for, and it's included in the blog post, but the content type application JSON, right? Like, I think that's the red flag. If you have the opportunity to control the content in that being returned with that content type application JSON, there's the opportunity then to feed that into the content security policy and reference that as your potential payload, right? Because it'll be whitelisted. So I mean, that is essentially the report, right? He finds the injection, gets blocked by CSP, then finds the analytics page and uses that and pops the alert and reports that. So switching gears from that, the second one, and this one's a little bit more in depth, and I particularly like this one because the blog post doesn't just say, here's what I found, and this is it. And the report kind of insinuates that, it's a 5 or 10 minute job, but there's actual reference to leaving this for a week or 2 weeks or something like that, and going through all the different pain points of breaking down what this vulnerability is. So in a nutshell, what ends up happening is there's this subdomain auth.uber.com that's used for logging in, and it looks like it's an OAuth endpoint because there's this next URL parameter, but then there's also this state parameter, and state is often associated with OAuth. So I could be entirely wrong, but given that it's a login and whatnot, I'm going to assume that. So at the beginning, you've got this next URL param, which is just kind of like what we talked about. Seeing a URL, you automatically want to play with it to see if you can redirect people elsewhere, if you can manipulate it, how that interaction occurs on the site. And so as it happens, you're able to manipulate this next URL and change it to kind of whatever you want to change it to. And it gets reflected back, and it's used in a location header. And so in doing so, it looks like there's an open redirect, but Uber doesn't really care about those. And so the author then tries the FTP protocol, which, I mean, wouldn't really be a whole lot there. But he also moves on to JavaScript. And so as it so happens, browsers won't use a location header to redirect to JavaScript and actually execute JavaScript. So again, he moves on. And this time he's looking at the data protocol scheme, whatever you want to call it, text HTML, and is able to use this. But again, when this happens from the location header, the origin happens to be null. Like you're not in the same context of uber.com. So at this point, I'd be really curious to see how many people actually continue to dig into this, because this seems to be a lot of the common things that you would test, and nothing coming up in your favor. And so I think even at this point, he mentions giving it a rest, right?
He does, yeah. I think that this one is super interesting here. I mean, if I was testing against this, I'm just going to be honest, like, I didn't know about the data colon trick here, to do the redirect, and you might get discouraged at this point because URL redirects are, via the OWASP Top 10, they're even deprioritized nowadays, right? And so, they're low on a lot of bug bounty, like rating taxonomies and stuff. And so you might, if you can get this far, but you can't pop actual cross-site scripting, and you can see that, it's only certain browsers actually that he can use at this point anyway. You might give up at this point, but he doesn't, and that's kind of one of the main points, I guess, of our blog. And we talked a lot about it in the last recording, but he takes this to like 3 or 4 steps forward, where he really puts some work into it. And one of the things that we talked about was just like from a program manager's point of view, doing a bug bounty, right? Like, the end result for a lot of the rating taxonomies out there is the end result and impact is usually what you're going to rate a bug as, but there is context behind that rating, right? So at Bugcrowd, we have the vulnerability rating taxonomy. Other markets use CVSS. Others do it just manually. They don't have a taxonomy to set expectations. So they all have this idea of, what the impact was of a bug. But in this case, you're going to go 3 to 4 steps in bypassing a whitelist, bypassing CSP, and putting a lot of work into the XSS. And so, as a program manager's view, usually what happens is the application security analyst who's assigned to the program will see that, there's been a bypass, and, the ultimate impact is a reflected XSS here. But a lot of work was put into this, and so they'll try to escalate the bug higher in priority. And this is one of the things I think we talked about, and it's not a great segue, but we talked about a little bit about how being a program owner and an ASE, whether it's Google's engineers who are triaging your bugs as part of their VDP, or it's Bugcrowd, or it's HackerOne, or whoever, right? They're actually advocating a lot of the time for you. So when they see a bug and they see something like this, and they know that there is a vulnerability that has untapped potential, in this case, maybe they would see it, maybe they wouldn't, but they ask for more impact, it's usually to help you. It's not to stymie your bug reports. I know that, when I'm a hunter and the first reaction I get is, can you prove more impact with this bug? It's like, why are you trying to challenge, it's kind of the same reaction you get as a dev when someone tells you have a security vulnerability, like my baby's ugly. It's like, why are you challenging my bug, right? And actually, for the most part, it's actually trying to challenge you just to get more impact so I can pay you more, right? Like we want on the back end, every market wants to pay the bug hunters the most as possible, right? They want you to get valid bugs. They want the customer to care about your cool bypasses. And at the end of the day, we're trying to like help people. So I think you and I talked a little bit about this, and it's something to point out at this case, like with these types of bugs that ultimately have the same impact, but they're just cooler ways to get to it, is completeness of report. And when you go to the end of this bug, I'm sure the report was very involved, talking just like his blog did about all the things he did. When you have a write-up like this, and and you're a triager or a security engineer on the project, it warrants a higher payout, because you can actually demonstrate that the researcher put in a ton of work on this, and it's a really cool bug, and it doesn't always get triaged by impact. Sometimes you can get like a P2 or P1 by cool stuff like this. So just warranting, yeah.
No, it's an interesting point from the perspective of the triager being there. The triager is really doing, I guess you call them security analysts, but they're there in between, right? So on the one hand, they're there to help the hacker kind of get the most that they can get, right? But on the other hand, that almost sounds negative towards the company, but I would argue that it's not, because if the company doesn't recognize or doesn't understand the security vulnerability, they might not triage it as critical as it should be, right?
Yeah.
Because the hacker hasn't articulated what that severity is. So by pushing that person to go a little bit further and demonstrate impact, there's value in the company side of it, because they'll understand, oh, you know what, this isn't a P3, this isn't a P2, this is a P1 that should be fixed yesterday, right?
Yeah.
As opposed
Yeah.
to, we have time, there's low impact, that kind of thing. So I think that there's definitely, it's interesting having the value from both sides of it. I've definitely been, I've experienced that myself, and have been super grateful, because I've taken vulnerabilities where there'll be times, where I'm hacking 4 or 5 hours, I want to get to bed, and I'm just like, oh, you know what, I found this vulnerability. I could probably take it further, but I don't know how much further, whether or not I would actually get anything out of it. At this point, I just want to report it, whatever. And then same thing, when you get that email, you just expect kind of the payout, and I figured it'd be a low payout, but you get pushback. And the immediate response is like, why are you pushing back? Just pay me my money. But when you take that step back and you think about it, each time that that's happened to me, I've come back with a better vulnerability, which has in turn resulted in a better payout. And to be quite frank, it's gotten me more energized about hacking. Like there's definitely, burnout's real, and so those types of opportunities for me, where you take something that's less critical and then find something that's really cool, I don't know, it gets me excited and me jacked up, ready to start hacking again.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, I think that after this bug, I'll kind of talk about one of the examples of this that we had at BugCrowd, but I'm sure it's a similar story across a lot of people who run bounty or responsible disclosure programs or vulnerability disclosure programs. But yeah, let's continue on with this bug and kind of break it down a little bit.
nice. I'm going to make a note that we don't miss that and come back to it. So
Yeah, no problem.
so we were at the point now where we've walked away from it. It doesn't seem like there's a whole lot here, and this is interesting as well, because at least for me, talking with people, there's always reference to how people take notes of things and come back to stuff. And for the longest time, I didn't really do that. I was just kind of like, oh yeah, I'll keep my burp history and whatnot. But now I've got a highlighting methodology for this exact reason. So he steps away from it, comes back to it, and he happens to be not logged in now, and recognizes that when he's not logged in and he goes through this process, the response code is a 200, not a 302. So he's getting redirected, but not through a location header, through actual JavaScript. That becomes important because it's no longer the browser's handling of the location header that is going to become the attack scenario, but really it's how do you manipulate that JavaScript. And so immediately he tries the JavaScript scheme, but nothing pops. And it turns out that they have that blacklisted. So he goes back to the data text HTML, which is awesome, because like you, I didn't have an appreciation for this maybe 3 or 4 months ago until Zed Shano tweeted out about this and helped me with a CSRF bypass using this, but uses this, but now he's got no alert box. So everything, same thing as before, everything should be lining up, should be having an XSS pop, but there's nothing there, and he validates that through the developer tools, and then he comes to realize that it's CSP that's blocking him. Now this is where it kind of gets interesting again. I feel like I keep saying that, but it's because it really does as the blog post goes on. When you look at the CSP policy, like, it's massive, right?
Yeah.
And so that is almost a key indicator that you need to poke and dig a little bit deeper, because when you have this blanket massive CSP policy, it almost runs contrary to the purpose of CSP, which is to limit your attack threshold, your landscape. And so here, when it's massive, you're not really doing that. So it looks like he looks at I've completely forgot how you pronounce this, so I'm going to pronounce it the same way I did in the first interview. Marketo, and you can correct that.
I think it's Marketo. Yeah,
Marketo. There we go. So uses Marketo, and this is the cool part. Going back to kind of like, how do you find the application JSON endpoints from the Twitter example? Like, where do you go and you look at your burp history? Here, it's a Google dork, right? And so I definitely don't think this would have occurred to me, but if you use a JSON P endpoint, that's going to return valid JavaScript, right? That's the design. And so uses a Google dork, which is, site marketo.com in URL callback. and it just so happens that there's a massive number of them. And
Yep.
so when you can manipulate that and adjust what the callback is, you can define your own JavaScript, which happens to be alert document domain in this case.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so um, and then he pops the alert box.
Yeah.
And I don't know, when we talked last, you happened to point out one of the most critical things here. So I'll pause and I'll turn it over to you, because I completely missed it the first time around.
Yeah. I mean, so at this point, right, you have unauthenticated cross-site scripting, right? And it's an unauthenticated CSP bypass cross-site scripting, but still the impact is kind of the same. And when you're doing bugs like this, and this is kind of the one story that I'll talk about in a second, is that proving the impact to the actual company more than just an alert box can sometimes get you paid out a lot higher. I know that a lot of people here at BugCrowd find a combination of CSRF and cross-site scripting and general like hygiene problems, like you don't need the password to change your current password or change the email address on the account or something like that, like just general security hygiene kind of stuff. And so at this point you can get a reflected XSS. He doesn't stop there. What he does is he actually messes with the state parameter on this URL and removes it, which allows him to continue the cross-site scripting for both an unauth and authenticated user here. And so that's like the third or fourth part of his escalation. But the story I keep on referencing is this idea of not just this cross-site scripting bug, but a bug in general. We had a client at BugCrowd pretty early on in my career here where I was still managing the triage team full time, and the client had a pretty locked down website, and I had tested against it, and some other people had tested against it, and not really found anything. But we had one researcher who had submitted a couple of independent bugs, like the ones we just talked about, like lack of password needed to change account data, cross-site request forgery on some of the stuff, and then cross-site scripting as well, a pretty fancy bypass of their cross-site scripting filter. And so independently, the application security engineer on the project was able to prompt the researcher to say, hey, you have all these individual bugs, and you could probably put them together to do like a from visiting a page, complete account takeover with email change and password change for this site, with you combining these bugs. And so they were able to prompt the researcher to kind of investigate this. The researcher did create like an HTML landing page that would, from nuts to bolts, take over any account if someone visited a web page completely invisibly, and then email him with like the new account credentials. It was had all kinds of cool smiley face graphics that spun while the JavaScript was loading and stuff like that. And yeah, so this was submitted, and as opposed to getting like maybe two P4 bugs or one P3 bug and one P4 bug, and then a P5 bug which doesn't actually pay on the program, they got a P1 because they showed full account takeover via a combination. So this like bug chaining and this idea of going further than just like finding cross-site scripting here is like really important. It actually, the more you can do of that kind of thing, the more the triage team and the internal security team really can appreciate the bug. I don't think there's anything worse than being able to say like, hey, Yoarsk, I sent you to a site and now I own your Shopify, store, right? Like showing them that, and there was no interaction needed. You just had to visit, a thing. It wasn't just taking the cookie; it was actually stealing the whole account. And so there's a lot of untapped potential for some of these bugs that researchers kind of even stop after finishing the one vulnerability category. And so I just thought that was a cool anecdote that like not a lot of people are taking advantage of, is chaining small bugs together to make really big bugs.
It's interesting, and we didn't talk about this in the last interview, but what popped into my head is I'm curious what your thoughts are. Like, I don't, hearing the story, I almost feel like we're spoiled, and that's why, like, maybe we don't take the extra step to go and do like the full count takeover, like we just do one bug at a time. But I'm also curious, do you think part of it is the race to report? Like, if you're not first, you're last, essentially, in bug bounty. So, like, when something like this happens, and somebody's reporting, like, say, like the minor, there's no confirmation on password check reset. If that comes in first, and then you get a report that uses that, plus change it with the cross-site request forgery, plus the XSS, like, how does that get treated comparatively?
it's still impact based, right? So you're
Okay.
taking advantage of mostly low level bugs to make a
Hmm.
critical bug. So um, it's a case by case basis, honestly, and since a lot of people don't do it right now,
Yeah.
um, like I don't have to deal with a ton of cases of it, but
Right.
when I think of an impact-based triage methodology, it's definitely would reward that bug and reward anything that's worth rewarding under it. So if someone reported
Hmm.
the XSS component or the CSRF component, those would get awarded, first if they came in first, and
Hmm.
then the person who finds the P1 takeover, like and chains everything together, a lot of the times will get rewarded as well.
Oh.
Just to show the impact. So there are cases where the client decides just to decide to award one and
Yeah.
duplicate out the others, but a majority of the cases I have seen have actually, if you show a full account takeover with minimal interaction by combining a whole bunch of bugs, like usually you'll get rewarded. So I mean, it is the fear of being first to report, I guess, and I go through that too when I'm hunting
Hmm.
bugs. So it's not foreign to me, right? Like I want to get in there, I want to put this bug in so that I don't get duplicated out, and that's just kind of the nature of this testing. But yeah, I think that more and more people are starting to learn that the wall of where people stop is pretty early. Like a normal
Yeah.
tester, 80% of the testers here would have stopped before you even use the data colon like schema here, right? So,
Yeah.
so really, if you take your time and build a really good bug, most likely it's going to be a positive outcome, I think. And on the back end, the ASCs are trying to fight for things like this too for the researchers to make sure that they get rewarded for the time they put into it if they submitted a good bug, right? Like not like they're not going to arbitrate for people who spam, bug bounty reports, but they're going to arbitrate for people who find good things. So.
Yeah, it's as we talk about it, I have a specific experience come to my mind as well, where I had actually reported cross-site scripting endpoint that was already known, but I showed how to take it further and actually exfiltrate data,
Mhm.
some critical data, and the customer loved it. And they reported that while they already knew about the XSS, they didn't realize that how you could take it a little bit further.
Mhm.
So there's definitely those opportunities where I think you and I talked about last time, like, do you just report you can steal the cookie, or do you actually go further? And the good example of that are the two write-ups. I'm not gonna I'm not gonna attempt to butcher the hacker's name, but the two write-ups on Yahoo Mail, where the one guy
Mhm.
was able to exfiltrate an entire mailbox,
Yeah.
and he did it twice on two different payloads, which is kind of nuts. Um,
Yeah. And if I remember correctly, he got awarded probably, I think, one level higher than he would have for just like a general cross-site scripting submission, right? I think. Can't
I
remember.
yeah, I just know, I think it was five figures.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which,
Yeah.
so yeah, I don't think you're getting five figures if it's not the
No. No.
top level,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, in a nutshell, I think we've covered a lot here. Like we talked about, kind of what CSP is. Hopefully people have a good understanding of that, what to look for, how to confirm whether or not it's the CSP that's blocking you, or XSS Auditor is pretty clear, because I think it blocks the actual page and just tells you, right?
Yeah.
But it's not going to be the React framework that is blocking that is
Yeah.
blocking your cross-site scripting payload. But then also, like, kind of what to look for when you're going to be hacking at those CSP policies, especially the broad-based ones.
Yeah,
And
I think that one thing I wanted to just add was there is a burp plugin for this. So there's
good
some
call. Yeah.
automation for finding these. And so what the burp plugin does is it'll find all of the CSP directives and content source, and it will prioritize in your passive scanner. So just while you're browsing, it'll throw up alerts saying, style or script content source was identified for your site here, which has CSP enabled already. So you should try to, use this endpoint to inject script to the site that you're testing. And so it's, I mean, it's not updated anytime recently. It's still about 2 years ago that it came out, but I don't think that this has really changed that much. So
Hmm.
getting those alerts would definitely, in my like methodology, and I'm always looking for things to help me with kind of stuff, these alerts would be valuable to me, right? Like missing CSP directive for different places and unsafe content source, bringing in script into the application. So yeah.
Yeah. And I think I mentioned before, like, you could install it just for the specific use, or
Mhm.
it almost makes sense to have it installed at all time, because they're just informational notices. And so
Yeah.
it's almost like, if you have it while you're browsing the entire time, it's
Yeah.
good to have that when you hit this roadblock, you have something to go back to. You're not starting from ground zero.
Yeah. It's called CSP bypass in the burp store.
Nice. Thanks for
Yep.
flagging that.
Yeah. No problem.
So yeah, I think that pretty much rounds out the interview. You and I were worried about kind of what the quality would be like recording it a second time, but we've definitely, I think we've hit everything we hit before as well as more. And if we're just looking at time, again, we've almost doubled that 15-minute original target of
Yeah,
keeping them
these seem
short
to
and
run a little
concise.
bit over. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, I think that's this one was interesting, right? Because I'm not an expert in CSP by any means,
Yeah.
and got to do a little bit of research and figure out kind of things to do. And as a methodology guy, I get the opportunity to take these blog posts and break them down and be like, all right, well, what should I do next time
Yeah.
I'm looking at parameters that are vulnerable to cross-site scripting, or that I don't get character encoded on but aren't executing. Like, what do I do here? And so, like, I just keep on building out this methodology. It was interesting you said, and I don't know if this would be valuable to the audience that we're kind of posting this to, but the idea of capturing methodology or using methodology while you're actually testing and taking notes and stuff like that. I think that would be a whole blog post in itself, right? Because it's not
Mm.
inherently a vulnerability that we're teaching people about, but it's kind of like, teach a person to fish instead of, like give them a fish,
Yeah.
I think that could be a cool one too as well.
Oh, I can be the guinea pig because I feel like my methodology is just terrible. It doesn't scale, and I need to find. I was always of the opinion like if you can't exploit it at this time, it's gone. But my React vulnerability is probably a key indication of that's not the case. So thankfully, I had that burp history and had that one fresh in mind a week later.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
Cool. All right. So again, I really appreciate double the time to
Yeah.
record this. And we should have. I think we have a good schedule of another maybe 4 or 5 to keep going. And so hopefully we'll have one up in another month, and people will continue to join us. I got a lot of positive feedback on the first one, so hopefully that continues with this one as well.
And are you, I don't know when this is going to go out, but you're actually doing a training pretty soon, right?
Oh yeah,
A bug hunting training?
yeah, yeah.
Where and when is that?
So this will hopefully be up tomorrow, and that training is going to take place at Hackfest conference in Quebec City. So that will be Wednesday and Thursday this week. So I guess that's November 1st and 2nd.
Okay.
It'll be kind of like the first guinea pig trial run for hacker training. And we'll see if it works out. I'm pretty excited about it. The material looks pretty awesome, and
Cool.
Yobert is helping me out with that, which is
Nice.
crazy.
Yeah. People should check that out, definitely.
Nice. I appreciate that. Thanks for the plug.
Yeah, man. All right, cool.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much again.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
And yep, thanks for listening.